Welcome to the meeting of Scrutiny Panel, and welcome to all our guests in our virtual meeting room and to everyone watching online. Just a few very brief housekeeping things before we start the main business of the evening. This meeting is being recorded and live streamed now. Please note the press may be in attendance and the rights of the press and public to record and film the meeting apply. Please, can you all keep your microphones on mute throughout? This will prevent any feedback. If you're still getting feedback, please turn off nearby devices. If someone forgets to switch off their microphone, we will mute you. All members and meeting participants should keep their cameras on. Please only unmute your microphones when you're required to make a presentation or to ask or answer a question. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand to get my attention. You will note there's a chat function. This should only be used to alert me that you wish to speak and to raise points of order or to report tech problems you might be having. Officers will assist you. The chat function must not be used for any other purpose, including conversations with other participants or for personal sensitive information. All chat is going to be recorded as this is a formal meeting. There is a requirement that if this meeting goes on for more than 2 hours, we should have a 10-minute break. We are going to finish this. My aim is that this meeting should finish at 9, so that won't be applying this evening. Thanks very much. So I've got item one, I've got one apologies from absence from Councillor Billington. So far, are there any other apologies being notified? No. Item 2, urgent items, order of business. There are no urgent items this evening. Item 3, declarations of interest. Do members have any interest to declare? Thank you. Okay, so we're now going on to item 4, the Chief Executive question time. And I'd like to welcome Tim Shields, Chief Executive of Hackney Council, who is going to give us an update on 3 key areas that we've asked him to focus on. The first one will be an update on the bullying and harassment at Hackney Council, which we had made inquiries into last year in Scrutiny Panel. Second one is the recent cyber attack and how that's impacted council services. And the third one is looking forward, a recovery plan from COVID-19. So over to Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, everyone. You've asked me to speak about 3 areas and then answer the questions. They're quite broad topics, so when answering questions, I may need to come back to you if there's some points of detail, but I'll do my best, as always, to answer whatever you're going to ask me. So those 3 areas, bullying and harassment, the cyber attack, and a recovery plan from COVID-19. So I'll start with bullying and harassment. And I last spoke about this subject. I spoke about this subject last year, but also the year before, Chair, if you remember. And this is something that the Scrutiny chairs have been looking at for quite some time. And this stemmed from some allegations around bullying and harassment in a particular service area within the council, which then sprung out into that session that was held. You'll no doubt remember that there are a number of participants in that session, including the unions at that point in time. Obviously, a lot happens in 2 years and a lot changes. The issues that were faced in that team at that point in time have been the subject of a lot of work and a lot of discussion, and I'm not proposing to go down all of that detail again and talk about those allegations. What I will say is that subsequent to that, within that particular service area, there was a lot of intense work and discussion between both the managers in that service area and those teams, and certainly things moved on substantially, and I won't go into discussions about individuals, but certainly a lot changed. What I will probably talk about, though, is around what's happened more recently, and I'm going to talk more broadly, so forgive me, I don't think it's particularly helpful just to talk about bullying and harassment, but to talk about more broadly about what's happening within the workplace. So there was a request at that point in time for the unions to be more engaged in terms of the work around policy, in terms around preventing harassment, microaggressions and bullying. And what's happened is there's been joint work with both the trade unions, including the chair of the Unison's Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic Group, and also some from our corporate equality team and from our equalities champions. The main aim was to make sure that those standards around microaggressions, including definitions, examples, etc., were clearly explained in the policy. However, we've taken the opportunity to update everything in terms of the format and consider other issues. Those revised policies will soon be discussed with the communications team and those equalities champions, and then we'll make sure that we launch that. In addition, there is a procedure that takes account of their different employment status, and then that is again being reviewed by the contracts manager along with our provider Matrix SCM. And we plan again to launch that guide along with that policy to make sure that agency staff that work for us via that contract are quite clear about what they should do in the case of harassment, microaggressions, bullying, when they commence their assignment. What I'll do now is briefly talk about more broadly, because of course what's happened throughout 2020 and continuing on to 2021 is, of course, we have had a global pandemic, which has completely changed the way in which we interact with our workforce as managers and changed the way that we work. I think some of you may have seen the numbers of webinars, the numbers of question and answer sessions that senior managers across the organisation have held with staff throughout the past 12 months. I'm not going to go into the detail of all of them, but they have been many. And they have ranged from sessions about COVID, sessions around general management issues, sessions around working from home, but also bespoke sessions around bullying, harassment, a whole range of areas. In addition to that, we have also been supporting people in terms of their mental health throughout this. So members may remember we introduced diversity champions across the organisation, and those diversity champions trained all senior managers across the organisation, and that was again very well received. We've now, as of today, introduced mental health champions, again to support our staff, and that launch happened earlier today. So throughout 2020, we've been more focused not just on things like bullying and harassment, but about supporting our workforce throughout COVID. What we've seen throughout this is that we have seen a gradual increase in some of our survey results. What we've been doing is regular pulse surveys throughout 2020 to make sure that we are testing where we are in terms of our staff. We've had very good feedback in terms of the support they're receiving from senior managers, clarity around what we're here to do, around the support around working from home has been very strong, and very strong about keeping our staff safe. Period. So the staff surveys have been very positive, and I'll just have a few headlines here. Managers genuinely care about staff's well-being. Managers are open to being flexible. Council's in a position to be successful over the next 5 years. We hold ourselves and our team members accountable for the work they do. We have a clear commitment to social responsibility. So there's many positive things. There are, of course, challenges throughout this period. Things like getting access to career opportunities is more complicated. And even though there's been a lot of positive about the visibility of senior managers, that needs to be kept up. You will also know that there was a commitment to increasing diversity at a senior level, and I can talk about that later. I'm sure that may come up in the questioning. So I'll probably stop there on bullying harassment and a bit of overview, because I'm sure you'll want to ask questions. I'll talk briefly about cyber and then a little bit about recovery. So I know, Chair, you're keen to keep this down to a fairly short introduction. So the cyber attack, again, I'm sure many of you have been aware of what happened. The attack in October 2020 was a major and sophisticated criminal act. This means that we lost a number of our key systems and that they were unavailable, and many systems are still unavailable. Our investment in modern cloud technology has meant that we've been able to carry on with meetings such as this, council meetings, all of our regular meetings, and as a cohort of staff, we've managed to carry out our work. Our teams have worked tirelessly and quickly as possible but the nature of the attack means that some of the work that's got to be done is very lengthy and very slow in order to recover systems and data that were lost. We have, of course, where we've needed to put in workarounds to make sure we can continue to sustain critical services, things like paying housing benefits or reporting of housing repairs. Some of our systems have already been recovered, and others are on their way of either being restored or replaced. But unfortunately, this is going to take some time yet to complete this. We continue to update our website with information on what services are and aren't available and how to get in contact with those teams. Members may have noticed that we have now successfully, one of the systems we lost was our elections team. And we successfully published a register on Friday after a huge amount of work from our elections team and some staff that volunteered to help them processing a backlog of electoral information. We share, of course, the residents' anger at this attack. It's been extremely disruptive, not only to our residents, but also to businesses, and also hugely disruptive to our staff. What we need to do now is continue to bring systems back up safely to recover data. Throughout this, we have, of course, been managing risk and making sure that we had risk managed around any potential data theft. We've worked closely with the National Crime Agency and the Metropolitan Police in order that we could identify risk and plan for those. And those plans were deployed immediately after we were notified that data was published on the 6th of January this year. The data that was published is quite small, very small compared to the data set that the council holds. But of course, we've been working very closely with police and other agencies to manage that risk. Throughout all of this, we've been working again with the Information Commissioner to make sure that they are fully briefed and they're aware of all of the actions we've been taking. And to date, the Information Commissioner has been very complimentary about the actions we've taken. I know, Chair, you'll want to move on to questions, so I'll then just briefly talk about recovery. This is not an easy question or an easy subject to talk about. If you'd have asked early on in 2020, people were talking about, and certainly we as a council were talking about recovery maybe being in September, October 2020. Of course, that hasn't happened. We've been in and out of lockdown, young people affected by not being able to go to school, impact on business, the economy, the list goes on and on and on. Throughout this, of course, we've had to continue a lot of our services and our staff have worked tirelessly. Social care, parks, refuse collection, all of those things have continued. We've provided support to businesses through grants. We've supported humanitarian assistance to, whether it's through food or prescriptions, to our residents. The list of things that we've had to do that were not planned have gone on and on, including the whole cohort of staff working in a completely different way. In amongst this, and as you'll be aware, we will be bringing budget proposals later this month forwards. So the budget challenge has been huge. Obviously, the strain of the pandemic on our finances has been large, but the government have, of course, helped us in terms of some of that funding. So we will be bringing forward a budget at the end of this month, of course, which will hopefully set us fair for 2021. In the long term, we sit here and sort of wait for lockdown to start ending, because we have been in and out of lockdown a number of times. We know now how to open our services back up quickly. Leisure centres, parks, playgrounds, all of those things. We know how to support business when they open back up. We know how to kick back in their refuse collection, all of those things that we do day in, day out. The difficulty with recovery is knowing what is going to happen and when it's going to happen. We know that the government make announcements regularly, school opening perhaps on the 8th of March, but that seems unlikely maybe, but we'll have to wait and see what happens with the infection rates. We know that there have been travel corridors opening and closing. We know that we've had Brexit. What we don't know is any certainty about what's going to happen and when. What we have done in the past, and we did last summer, was open things back up again. So we opened up those facilities that we closed down, and we have a well-used plan that will do that. In the longer term, there will be an impact on mental health, there'll be an impact on social care, there'll be an impact on the health system, there'll be an impact on our finances, there'll be an impact on business. The list goes on and on and on. We're quite clear that we have the ability to support in those areas, but what we aren't clear about is what the long-term impact of this pandemic will be. And I think that's something that will take a number of years to become clear across the piece. But so trying to write down this is recovery isn't quite that simple, because different parts of the business, different parts of the borough, different parts of our economy and the impacts are constantly changing. As soon as we get clarity around we're coming out of lockdown and this means these things, we then start to interact with business, with schools, with all of those establishments you'd expect us to, including our staff, to try and give them clarity about what happens and what the next steps are. I suppose what I'd say is we have in our back pocket a number of plans or pieces of plans that we can kick in should we need to. But to have one holistic, here's our recovery plan, at this point in time is not really realistic. I'll stop there, Chair, because I know you wanted me to only do about 11 and a half or 12 minutes. I've gone slightly over, I apologise for that. There is so much to say on these subjects, but happy to take questions, of course. And I've got Ian, I know Ian probably won't thank me for this, but Ian's here as well. So Ian is, of course, well versed in the cyber piece as well.
Thanks very much, Tim. I'll start off with a couple of questions from me, and then I'll open the floor to colleagues, if people could indicate they want to come in. Just on the first subject in relation to bullying and harassment, you've said that throughout the course of 2020, I think that pulse surveys of staff have shown an improving picture. How does that compare with surveys in the preceding years before the pandemic? And also, during this year, 2020, what sort of numbers of complaints have there been and grievances in relation to these areas? And what sort of, is there any sort of trend that you can identify of what they've focused on? Anything that's different, during the online working? And my second question really is in relation to the cyber attack. What reassurance can you give residents in relation to their data that they've shared with the council, that is not going to be published or used for criminal purposes? I don't know whether you want to take those two first, and I'll bring two colleagues in. Thank you.
Okay. So when I started my introduction on this, you'll be aware that the subject was drawn out by a particular set of circumstances within a particular team. Throughout 2019 and into early 2020, despite having staff helplines, ability to report bullying and harassment through a third party, so that there is no knowledge of who the person reporting is, all of those safeguards in place. During 2019, early 20, I'm only aware of a very few cases, and I'm talking one or two. Throughout 2020, the levels of reporting has dropped right away, and that's possibly because of the level of home working. So you have very much got people working, most of our workforce, working remotely at home. And the main focus of those surveys has been about those things, about working from home, about people's mental health, and about the barriers working from home. And that's why I spoke about people saying, well, things like career opportunities are problematic because, of course, they're not working in teams. There's limited movement within the internal job market. And so people's ability to move around has been limited. They talk about collaborating across directorates, but again, that's more difficult when you're working remotely. Albeit, I would say the collaboration across directorates on some particular areas, working on vaccinations or working on keeping schools open or working on testing or humanitarian assistance, has been absolutely stunning. And people have stepped up, and I mentioned the election earlier, there are people coming from lots of other teams in to help to assist on that, and the same on the cyber attack. So the levels of complaints have dropped right away, and that's probably as a result of the remote working. And the caseload in terms of those complaints, again, has dropped right away. So that's what I'd probably say to that. In terms of reassurance around data being shared, when I talked about cyber, what we put in place, Ian and Rob and the team put in place throughout late autumn, early winter, was a plan for each of the systems and each of the data sets. Should anything have been lost and should anything be published. That plan's quite groundbreaking because, of course, this isn't something that has happened regularly to organisations, certainly not in the public sector. Working very closely with the National Crime Agency and the National Cyber Security Centre and the Metropolitan Police. When the publishing of data did happen at the beginning of January, we were quite clear what action we needed to take. We are, I think, pretty clear, Ian, about the fact that people haven't lost. This isn't a case of it's a bank where people's bank details have been lost with all of that, and they've got to put those safeguards in where personal information has been compromised. We have written or contacted those individuals directly to make sure they're aware of that, and so that they can put appropriate safeguards in place. So this isn't one of those cases where suddenly there's tens of thousands of sets of banking details being published. Some of it that was published was extremely boring. HR manuals and things like that. But there was some sensitive information where we've had to directly contact individuals, but we've contacted them and ensure they've put appropriate safeguards in place as quickly as we could. And I should probably thank the staff after that data was released. They worked night and day to go through that data, risk assess that data, and make sure the appropriate actions were taken. So that reassurance has been given out to. There is one area that, of course, coming up to an election, members will become aware of, and the fact that we have written out to all of the postal voters to refresh their signatures and their dates of birth. This isn't because we've lost the data and it's been published. This is because the data is locked and we cannot access it. So whilst we have a full register, which we've been able to publish, what we can't access is their date of birth and signature in a file because it's been locked. So we have written out for a refresh, but they shouldn't be concerned we've lost it. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Ian.
I think the only thing I might just add, Tim, is, and apologies if I missed it when you were running through things, is that, of course, now all the data that was published has been taken down. And that's obviously an important point to make. I think, as you outlined, the data that was actually published is a very small subset of all the data the council holds. So also recognising that point. But yes, absolutely fantastic work from the team to work through in great detail, working closely with colleagues in the police, any risks that come out from any of that data, and phenomenal amounts of data is being reviewed. So yeah, and probably worth adding in, some members on the call were at the session we held before the commencement of the Public Audit Committee as well. We had a very good session, I thought, with Councillor Sharman and members of the committee there going through things. And as we've done previously, we're very happy to continue doing that throughout this process. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Ian, I did miss that, and it was published on the dark web, which is somewhere, I don't know where it is, but someone can find that. And yes, it was taken down very quickly, so it's no longer there.
Thank you. I'll now bring in Councillor Hayhurst and then Councillor Snell.
Thanks, Chair. Just before I ask questions, can I just say, I think since we last met, and perhaps if Tim's not going to be here in the next meeting in March, obviously Tim's announced his retirement in that period, and just to say a huge thanks to Tim for his immense contributions to the council over the years. He's been a bedrock of stability, taking this council to the most improved council, and I don't think any of us can underestimate what he's achieved and done for us, and it will be enormous shoes to fill. So thank you very much, Tim. Can I just ask? I do just want to ask sort of one sort of slightly off topic question in relation to that, in terms of sort of stability of the council, sort of just going forward, because obviously your retirement in May, we've got several new heads of directorate coming in, and I think it'll only be Ian that will be left, who will have sort of over a year's worth of institutional memory at the top team. So just I will ask a question about the cyber attack in a minute, but Tim, if you could just briefly sort of say about what planning you're putting in and what you're able to do to ensure sort of a stable transition as best you're able to. So that's my first question. My second one is just in relation to the cyber attack. I mean, it strikes me, incidents like this happen. I was very impressed by the transparency of the council. I'm not necessarily sure private organisations and others who have been subject to cyber attacks have handled it in the same way, with the candour that was done. So I actually think there's a degree of congratulations to be done how it has been handled. Just in sort of understanding, and I appreciate it's an active crime scene still, and that there may be limits on what you can say, but I mean, I remember meetings going back where Rob's sort of saying, look, as a sort of a due diligence process will often pay hackers to try and hack us to make sure that we are safe. You know, and good practice like that. So was this something that this was just a level above that any of us were expecting in terms of the sophistication of it, which is sort of how it happened? And in terms of going forward, again, are we sort of, how confident are we in terms of being able to resist future attempts, and what sort of have we upped our game in that respect?
Okay.
I think I'll just bring in Councillor Snell before you answer that, Tim, and then just to keep them in twos. Then another round. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to reflect on staff usage in particular through the COVID recurrent crises. I did volunteer early on and wasn't really used a great deal, but I've been very grateful to be made extensive use of in the new vaccine volunteering system, because it's been terribly helpful to me as a member of Health Scrutiny to see what's happening on the ground, and have told them how impressive I've been. I just want to say congratulations, because my experience first time around was that we redeployed officers left, right and centre to cope with the developing crisis, and there was a slight feeling that we didn't get on top of the volunteer network, and some of us were worried whether it was being properly managed and properly coordinated. And so the fact that the volunteer hub capability has been maintained and in fact grown over the periods, so they can take on food banks and everything else, is I think an excellent idea, because it is one of our strengths. We never know when we're going to get the vaccines, and the ability to suddenly deploy an extra 50 volunteers at 5 hours notice makes an enormous difference to the rate at which we can use what we get. I just wanted to, Tim, if you could just talk me through what happened, because first time around, I know there was all sorts of redeployment. There were library staff going and phoning their customer list and checking everyone was all right. We had a triage system operating, going around all our vulnerable clients and making sure all the various needs were in place for them. I mean, to some extent, I guess that we know most of those people already, so we're starting from a more informed place. But, you know, what are we doing with our staff? Libraries are closed. Are we finding them other uses? Can we have a feel for how we're using them, whether they're all feeling valued, and how this compares with first time around? I would certainly hope we're doing it better. As I say, as far as volunteering was going, I'm certain we're doing it better. I just wondered how we're managing to use the staff. What are the stresses this time around?
Okay.
Tim, are you okay with those questions? So change at the top, future protection against future attacks and volunteers. Thank you.
Yes, I said this would be wide-ranging, didn't I? When I started my introduction. So, Councillor Hayhurst, thank you for the kind words. So I have to say, on the 31st of May, I was intending to return. So if people need to ask me anything, then I'll still be around. Should someone need to contact me, or any bit of institutional memory. So in terms of stability, many of you will be aware that I promoted a restructure, and it was actually due to happen a lot quicker than it did, but the pandemic slowed things down. And the restructure really should have been completed somewhat earlier, but in November, October, November, a restructure was launched, and that led to a new structure being agreed. That then moved through to the appointment of some new directors, and Councillor Hayhurst, you were on the interview panel for one of those, and the Director of Adult Health and Integration is starting on the 15th of place. You'll be aware that Ashman Ali has been appointed as the Director of Neighbourhoods and Housing. So again, that's another piece of the management team put in place. Ian is here, and by the time I leave, we are going out to advert for the Director of Children's and Education on Thursday. So that person should be appointed by the time I leave. And I'm not getting involved in the appointment of my replacement, but I'm sure there are people that are dealing with that as of now. So whilst I am only on 4.5 months to 5 months to actually find a replacement. So I think by the time I leave, most of the management team should be in place. Many of you will be aware that below those group director roles, there were some director roles, and they are being recruited to as we speak. So the interview for the Director of Legal and Governance will be in a couple of weeks' time. The Director of Housing, I think, is being shortlisted in the next few weeks, as is the Director of Adults. So this is part of my thinking about retirement date, was I wanted to be confident that the majority of those seats were filled at the point I left, probably leaving the Chief Executive role as the only substantive vacancy at that point in time. So that was my aim, in order to create that stability. The group directors, of course, will be in place with Helen starting very soon, and that will mean that we can try and manage a stable transition through that. So I'm pretty confident, and that's part of my thinking about choosing a retirement date, that the majority of those senior posts within the council will be filled, and that should give that stability. In terms of cyber, yes, we have been very transparent. Of course, it is public data. Yes, there are a number of public sector companies that have not been as transparent. Indeed, you sometimes find that your personal data has disappeared a number of years afterwards. As a public authority, we were required to let the Information Commissioner know of the attack and any potential data loss within 72 hours, and we did it much quicker than that. And we have been very open with the Information Commissioner about what's been happening step by step. To test security. We are clear that this attack impacted on some of our legacy systems. Our desire is to move our systems into the cloud, which should completely prevent this happening again. But there are some very, as we all know, some very, very sophisticated hackers out there that don't just hit us, they'll hit government departments, schools, public sector organisations, even Manchester United. And people that spend many, many more millions than we do on security, and people still manage to get through. As we address some of the legacy systems, our intention is to strengthen that security even more. But of course, this relies upon us being vigilant all the time. I know that Rob, as Director of ICT, of course, we have been communicating with other local authorities and public bodies to make sure that they pay attention to their security as well, because of course as a public sector we want to make sure everyone is protected. I'll come on to Councillor Snell's question. Well, Councillor Snell, of course, you may have signed up through the government's volunteer network in terms of being employed to do that. And we know that the usage of some of those volunteers throughout the pandemic has been variable. I know that the volunteering has gone down particularly well at the vaccination centres, and certainly my wife went and volunteered at the local vaccination centre on Friday, very much enjoyed it, and it certainly enjoyed the interaction with people throughout that day. So I think the usage of volunteers has been variable, but if I come to our staff, the staff usage through the crisis, obviously this came upon us very quickly in the first wave. I have to say the staff that stepped up, we had people from housing repairs going and delivering food parcels, people from parking, we had drivers, we had people in contact centres phoning people, we had library staff checking in on their clients. It was absolutely astounding. Thousands and thousands of people contacted. On that first wave, one of the things we struggled with was what was called the shielding list, which was supplied, and the data was not as good as it could have been. We spent a lot of time working through both our data on social care systems and other systems to make sure we identify those people that are vulnerable from our systems and matching those with the government shielding list, and also interacting with our health colleagues to making sure that we identified those people that are most at risk and we supported them. You may be aware that the government then reduced the shielding list to what's called CEV, so clinically extremely vulnerable list. So there are less people on that now, but we are still, as we've gone into the most recent lockdown, we continue to phone people. Contact numbers should they be in any kind of trouble. The contact from our staff has been hugely appreciated. Of course, some people are lonely, some people require things, some people want help, and that's been very, very much appreciated. As things have gone on, moving out of the first wave and moving through the summer, one of the main problems at the beginning of the pandemic was the availability of food and the availability of pharmacy and people's ability to get out and about. Now, of course, and you would have seen this in the press, the supermarkets have stepped up hugely, and there are more delivery slots available. And if I talk about my parents, early on, they were struggling to get food, and certainly my sons and my brothers were taking them food to their doorstep. Now they're on a regular rota to get their food delivered. So a lot of that's worked its way through the system, so that's not quite so intense for us. Also, the pharmacies got better deliveries and all those things, so people have got tapped into those networks. In terms of redeployment, last time we had a large number of redeployments around PPE, around food delivery, around contacting people. We haven't had to do as much of that at this point in time because there are less people to look after, because there are many more people self-serving. But nonetheless, people like the library staff are continuing to phone people up and talk to them and contact them. I can't have in my head every single person that's been redeployed to what, but we have a large number of redeployees working across the organisation. We have carried skills assessment for all of our staff, or the majority of our staff, so we're aware of what their skill sets are. So should we need to redeploy people to a particular new thing, then we can quickly do that, because we can identify their staff, what their skills are, and then ask them to be redeployed. Okay, Chair, well, hopefully that's a question.
Thanks very much. And now I think we can have one last round of questions. So I've got Councillor Ette. Does anyone else got a question? Councillor Ette, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to echo my colleague, Councillor Ben Hales and others with regards to the Chief Exec. I mean, when I saw the email that you were leaving, it was a shock, and I think that was one of the first shock of the year that I read. There's no doubt you will be definitely missed. And let me use this opportunity to say a big thank you, because I remember coming in as a new councillor, being a deputy speaker and speaker. I was more or less like a novice, and there's so many mistakes. And the way you correct and your leadership, I mean, is really fantastic. And sometimes, and I'm thinking, maybe we could begin to have Hackney Walk of Fame, because what Hackney is today from where it was, you are the main person that made it happen with your team. Thank you very much for all the hard work. You've actually answered some of the questions, but just to move on quickly, I just wanted more explanation in terms of the policy, which is with regards to the harassment and bullying, and the one you've talked about that you've done. You're working with the union. I'm just thinking, is there any time frame when this will be finalized? That's the only thing. And with regards to the diversity with the senior level, I know it's a lot of work. There's been a lot of work and transformation, no doubt about that. And we must be really proud of this. And considering the structure and everything that is coming into place, will the diversity increase be taken into consideration at senior level when all this, in terms of restructuring, when it's being done? So I just wanted a bit more explanation on that. Thank you very much for all the hard work.
I think Councillor Coburn's just got one last question. You're coming, Councillor Coburn. Thank you, Councillor Ette.
Again, Tim, just to echo what everyone said, I can't really say much more, but honestly, as Councillor Ette just said as well, like, you've always been great support, and as a resident of Hackney, not as a like putting my council side of hat, you know, I think I was, when did you first start, if you don't mind me asking, at Hackney?
July 2002.
2002. I was only 10 years old then, so I've seen the massive difference that you've made to Hackney, and I remember how it was as a little kid. So thank you to you and everyone who's made that possible. I wanted to pick up on your point, Tim, about I completely get it. I think it's very difficult, you know, this whole conversation about how we rebuild our economy and, you know, recovery. It's very difficult because the situation is continuously evolving, and, you know, of course, our efforts have to be focused on how we mitigate the impacts and the on, you know, our economy and our people, etc. But I guess, you know, given the fact that you are going to be sort of departing from Hackney, what would be your advice to us as councillors on the areas that we should be looking out for and we should be holding the new chief executive and leadership to account, sort of over the next couple of years?
Yeah, and thanks very much for that, Councillor Coburn. If I could just maybe add, Tim, I mean, obviously, you know, you've had an amazing run. Hackney's been the best council of 20 years on your watch, as well as numerous other achievements. You know, maybe if you could just share with us what you're most proud of during your time. Thank you, as to end on that note.
Okay. Thought you wanted to stay to time. Right, okay.
I do.
So thank you for all those kind words. Councillor Ette, I haven't got an actual date when the policy will be released, so I can get that for you. It's going through a last round of discussions with the diversity champions and the unions, and then talking about the launch and the communications around that. So we can get a date for the launch of the policy for you. In terms of diversity at a senior level, and it's something I missed in my introduction, throughout the following the restructure report, we then went out to recruit to some of those senior posts. What we decided to do was include within that process from start to end. So we have brought on a company that specifically focuses on diversity in the workplace. And that was a process of interviewing myself and others involved in that process as to what they wanted to get out of it and what success would look like. We changed language, we changed our approach, we changed advertising. We changed a whole range of things throughout the process. This was really a test bed to see whether we could make the process more inclusive and attract a more diverse range of applicants. To a degree that was successful, and to a degree it wasn't. I think it's quite difficult to bring about such a change. What will happen as a result of that is the company that we got in to give us the advice on this is going to write a short report, which will then be used to reflect into and learn from to use for other recruitment within the organisation. One of the things I'm particularly keen on as a result of those conversations is transparency. Transparency about where we advertised, who applied, and obviously not their names, but in terms of the diversity, what the process was, and to learn from that and then to add that into other processes. So that The next piece you'll see, which is the recruitment of the Group Director of Children's and Education, but also the Director of Children's and the Director of Housing. So what we've learned out of that first round of recruitment will be so you should gradually see change coming through, and I think some of those people that are on the panel for those interviews will have seen some of the reflections coming through in that recruitment. Councillor Coburn, your question about how to rebuild the economy. I think one of the fortunate things that Hackney does have, we don't have high streets with those massive businesses that have unfortunately gone out of business. The Debenhams, the Topshops, all of those things. We tend to have a lot of smaller businesses, more niche. Obviously, we do have the Boots and all of those things, but our economy is slightly different. It's not big high street economy that we've seen failing. So I think for me, one of the key things we've got to do, and this is the success of Ian and his team, they've had to flip from collecting revenue from businesses in the form of business rates and other things. We've had to flip to paying out business grants. And that's been hugely hard work for that team. New schemes, constantly changing grant conditions, all of those things. But they've been very, very successful at getting those grants out and supporting those businesses. We've also been very clear about our support for businesses in terms of their COVID compliance and helping them and making sure we're out and about talking to those businesses. So for me, the critical thing is going to be about providing those businesses, making sure we get those business grants out to them, making sure when that economy does open up, that it opens up quickly. And you would have seen that we need to open up the markets, we need to open up our town centres, all of those things. And be really clear about things like shopping local, how important people's local economy is. What would be my advice to councillors? Continue to talk about supporting business, how important it is. I get that the Chancellor's Exchequer is in a very difficult place, and we've seen billions and billions of pounds gone out of the Treasury's coffers. But how essential business is to the lifeblood of London, to the lifeblood of Hackney. And I think continuing to talk about local business, shopping local, supporting local businesses, trying to just get them through this and keep them going so that we can all open back up in a safe way. Councillor Gordon, my advice to councillors, I suppose keep doing what you're doing. Being a councillor is a bit of a thankless task at times. You don't get a huge amount of thanks. And when people say, well, why don't they do this and why don't they do that and shouldn't they think of this? And my response to that is because a lot of you do this in your spare time. It's hard work. You sometimes get abuse. You sometimes rarely get thanks, but sometimes do. It's complex. My response to those people that criticise and elected councillors is you have a choice. If you don't like it, go and get yourself nominated and go and get yourself elected. And then, but if you can't bother to do that, then just shut up, go away. The same as I say, and I'll be probably more. Some people say to me, can't you do a better job? Can't you do this? Can't you do that? And so I quite often say to people, there are some vacancies. Would you like to apply for a job if you think you can do it better? So I think keep doing what you're doing. Keep with it. Most proud. There's probably quite a long list. One of the early things that I did was unlock Woodbury Down, which had been sitting there, and negotiated the PDO, the first version of the PDO, and that was stuck, and got that unlocked and got Woodbury Down moving. You will know this: the direct negotiation of the Building Schools of the Future contract with the Department for Education and with the builders, £167 million. Coming in, making sure that all of those secondary schools were. Those are nice things. The Pembury project, the piece of work around young black men, which many people won't know that was started quite some time ago. So those things. In summary, I think it's probably one, creating a borough that is safer, economically vibrant, people want to live in, less crime, better economy, better housing, all of those things, fantastic education, all of those things you expect me to say. But an organisation that is hugely resourceful and strong and performs to a very, very high level. And it's not just about the performance of the organisation and what it's achieved, but it's also about the culture of the organisation. It's a nice place to work. There are amazing people that do amazing things day in, day out. And it's not a place where there's a poor culture, where people don't like working. People love working at Hackney. And some people love it so much they go away and come back and go away and come back again, because they've gone to work for another council and say it's not like Hackney. So I think that's apart from the borough and all the services, one of the proudest things is an organisation that has a culture as it does and performs at such a high level. And you can say thank you to me for all of these things, but I am absolutely nothing without that team that works alongside me and all of their staff. There are some people that anything I ask them to do, they will do it. So I'll pause there, because you allow 55 minutes for this session, and the 55 minutes is up.
Thank you very much, Tim. And thank you very much for all you've done and that helpful session. So you're very welcome to stay for the rest of the meeting.
I think I'm going to go and Councillor Gordon share, so I'll leave you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. We're now moving on to agenda item 5, which is the quarterly finance update. And I'd like to welcome Ian Williams, who understands has got, and Councillor Deputy Mayor Rebecca Ennison. I understand that, Ian, you're going to start with a slide presentation, then talk to it.
I think that's, well, Councillor Gordon, good evening, everybody. Certainly Councillor Ennison and I, probably our usual team acts on this, so I don't know if Councillor Ennison, you want to just do a quick introduction, then we move to presentation.
That's fine, thank you.
Yeah, to manage expectations, I'll be very quick, don't worry. It was just, we're at that slightly strange transition point now where even though we, a lot of our tracking data sort of almost midway through the current financial year, even though obviously data-wise we're not far through end, the focus all switches to next year's budget. So it's just a couple of things. It's to thank Audit and Scrutiny for their role in both scrutinising the current year's budget and the impact of coronavirus, but also the coming year. It's to say, I'm sure it doesn't need saying, but obviously we have the full budget process coming forward to Cabinet and Council next month, where obviously we'll be talking a lot about the proposals we're bringing forward then. So it's perhaps not, or perhaps not preempting some of those conversations necessarily tonight. And it was just certainly from my point of view, but absolutely obviously Scrutiny's decisions to what you want to focus on. But from my point of view, I think focusing on where we're looking at ending this financial year probably be quite helpful, because I always get nervous at this point in the year that the attention just switches to the following financial year, and that's quite a dangerous position, particularly in current times. And also I'm aware, I know there's been various updates in other places, but we have much more way of detail from the government's spending commitments and financial support for the coming year now, and where the members want to quiz in a little more on some of that this evening. As I say, absolutely your call, but certainly I would find it helpful to spend a bit of time on this year's financial position if members choose to do so.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'll now move over to Ian for your update, and I certainly think it would be nice to hear, well, it'd be very useful to hear more of the detail in terms of the end of this year. Thank you.
Great stuff, and thank you for that, Councillor Gordon. I'm just going to go and put the presentation to appear on screen. Can you just let me know if that's appeared?
Yes, it's fine.
And you can also see that all fine. Great stuff. Obviously, when I do this, I can't see people signalling to speak or ask questions. So if maybe I could ask Chair, I'm happy to take questions as we go, if that works for you. If that is the simplest way of doing it.
I'll let you know.
Great, thank you. Okay, so as always at this time of the year, I'm going to give you a quick update on where we are with the budget proposals for certainly development for next financial year, so 2021-22, but also an update of where we are in relation to the current financial year. I also want to touch upon some emerging themes that are coming through as well. Obviously, we're now into the most recent lockdown period, and that obviously is having an impact upon our future forecasts, and I'll give you an update of where we're getting to in that piece of work. So going to run through latest position in relation to the general fund. You've had a detailed report in the papers this evening on the latest position around the housing revenue account, and in particular the proposals for next year to increase housing rents by CPI plus 1%, and so a further update on the position for 21-22. So I think we can all remember probably one of the earliest scrutiny panel sessions in the current municipal year, where we were looking at some absolutely eye-watering financial pressures in terms of what our forecast was back in that April-May time. And you'll recall how then we were forecasting shortfalls of around £60 million, certainly before there was any announcements of or clarity of what support government was going to be provided. We've also been working hard to refine our forecasts, and also have had the clarity now of future government's support in terms of the 4 tranches of funding that have come forwards, which has enabled us to manage down that overall deficit we were recording to a much smaller level than it was originally. But I think we also recognise, don't we, that an awful lot of the things that were brought to bear there, albeit around the collection fund and sales fees and charges, were in particular relatively short-term sticking plasters. Obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done, particularly on the collection fund side going forwards, about understanding across the country what the long-term impact of that will be as we see unemployment rise and people come off furlough schemes, as well as other pressures. So I think, yeah, absolutely, there's significant uncertainties that do lie ahead. The new lockdown, new COVID variant, and increased infections will all have challenges in terms of our increased spend, and will no doubt impact upon our income. We put in place really comprehensive support packages for our voluntary and commercial tenants, as you'll recall, at the start of the pandemic. But again, since those have been put in place, particularly on the commercial side, we're having to work, as you'd expect, ever more closely with those tenants, because they just haven't been able to open to the extent that was envisaged when we put in place the first package of supports. So we can't assume at the year end that the external funding allocation will cover all of the additional spend and income losses. But I think what we can see from the forecast coming forwards, that as the scrutiny panel quite rightly asked very much at the outset, would we find ourselves in that position we've seen some other councils be in, albeit very few far between. The Section 114 point, certainly nowhere near that, but equally we mustn't lose sight of the fact that it is very challenging, and continue to work hard with all the professional societies and through the LGA to make sure we lobby for the funding that local government does need and deserves, for its response to this pandemic. We are seeing, and we've always tried to be very clear in terms of how we present things. So you'll recall, again, ever since the outset of this, I was keen not just to badge any overspend as COVID related. I think we have to be transparent and open about the fact that there are some things that are non-COVID, in as much as that's possible. And we've always made sure we've clearly marked what is COVID and what isn't COVID. And what we are starting to see is that overspend that's of the non-COVID area continuing to show an upward trajectory. And I think there's some work to do, certainly with the new group directors when they come in relation to how some of the budget management in those departments can be taken forward. But what we have looked to do as part of the budget build for next year is, as much as we can, look to make sure we've covered off all the genuinely known pressures that exist. So it's certainly a much improved position since we presented to Scrutiny Panel at the start of the pandemic, but the medium-term challenges do increase. And let's be honest, we're still very much at the foothills of the cyber attack. I know that say Rob and I have done a number of updates over the last few months in relation to that, and Tim's answered a few questions this evening. But for me, we can't lose sight of the impact of the cyber attack and COVID together on our overall financial position. So just turning to some headline numbers for you there, you can see that in total we're looking at an overspend of around £3 million for effectively what we're calling here the combined general fund outturn position. And obviously that's something which, now that we're completing the latest monitoring return, so this will be the report, some of the numbers that go in the OFP for February's committee meeting, we're taking on board the further lockdown that we've experienced and some further clarifications around losses of income and additional spend being incurred by respective departments into that. So I think we'll be forecasting a modest uptick on what's presented here, but certainly nothing that's going to cause us a problem in the short term for certain. All pleasing to note that we've already received our first tranche of money in relation to the sales fees and charges income. So we've already received £4.5 million of cash in the last calendar year, and I've submitted our second return in relation to that as well. So seeing good progress in getting that money in, because obviously that was our estimate, wasn't it, very much at the start of the process and before the full details of the scheme had been properly released and properly road tested in terms of seeing the colour of the money, for want of a better word. So it's encouraged to see that coming forwards. And of course, we've now had greater clarity on how the collection fund scheme will operate in terms of deferring some of that council tax loss, business rate loss into future years. I know that this has been a piece of work that members equally are interested on, and what I've included here is a slide summarising where we are in terms of our latest position around capital. And departments are still forecasting spend of around £227 million for the current financial year. And obviously the major element of that, a significant scheme here, is our flagship Britannia development scheme, for which an awful lot of work's been done to make sure that programme stays to programme in some of the most challenging and unprecedented times for doing major capital works probably ever, in terms of the pandemic we're experiencing. So again, you've got a detailed report in the papers to this agenda on the current year's capital position as well. I spoke briefly in the introduction about the housing revenue account, and say that if people have got any specific questions on that, I know it's had a good airing in a number of places. So if there are any questions, Deirdre and I are more than happy to answer those in relation to the housing revenue account. Councillor Gordon, I heard a hand, I think it was, come up. Is there a question anyone's got now on the current year's budget position, or are you happy for me to move on to future years?
I can't see a hand actually. If someone wants to speak, can let me know.
I think it was the mayor arriving and pinging up in the message box.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry
about that. All right, no, just carry on here.
So an update then on the post-spending review and local government finance settlement. So following the spending review and local government finance settlement, members will be aware of the revised budget gap before application of any one-off costs and income. And we were looking at their need to find savings of around £11 million. That was based upon our external funding estimates at the time, and also assuming a council tax increase of just shy of 4%. So the previous notified clarification of the 2% adult social care precept and the 1.99% referendum level. We've been working closely with the executive and departments to make sure we concluded our work on closing that gap through the identification of a combination of directorate savings proposals and then a utilisation of that COVID and one-off money. We've also made sure in developing a budget strategy we've had regard to the impact of cyber attack. I would can reinforce the point that that is still work that's very much in progress. We had a very helpful session, probably one of the most detailed sessions I can recall in 10 years of doing this role, with chairs and vice chairs of Scrutiny and Audit Committee on the 8th of December, which I think was really well attended. And I think it was a really helpful session where we saw detailed proposals set out by Cabinet members and the group directors, and some really good scrutiny of those proposals. We've also continued to do and have plans in place to continue going forwards that further work and engagement required on savings for the current year, to make sure we've got proper understanding of implementation and delivery, but also then taking forward the very necessary work to put in place our plans for the next financial year. I think we all can recognise that the challenges we've had to deal with in preparing the budget for 21-22. We again find ourselves, don't we, after only having had a 1-year spending round, of walking back into that cycle that we seem to have been in for a few years now, of the government only being able to announce a 1-year spending round. And I think one of the things I'm very keen to push with government, with the Chancellor, is actually we do need and deserve some certainty for the 22-23 financial year, well before we got it this year, which, as you all know, was literally on the cusp of the Christmas break, which is just far too late in the day for any sensible financial planning. And I think we should lobby hard for government to put in place something that, even if it is a rollover plus budget for that year, would be something which would give us certainty and avoid having to do any unnecessary work, identifying a range of options that anticipate things like fairer funding reviews, business rates resets and the like. Some of that certainty they can give us outside of just a spending round period, I feel. What was announced in the spending round was, again, not a surprise, and I know there's been a lot of coverage, hasn't there, on this in the local government press. A lot of coverage around the increase in spending power for local government, but the reality was the majority of that wasn't through extra government grant. It was upon the assumption that local authorities would increase council tax by not just the previous maximum level of 1.99 plus 2%, but actually to 4.99%, and at the same time also an assumption that there would be a proportionate increase in council tax base as well for local authorities across the country. So obviously that's something we have as an option that's there, and obviously something which is being discussed with the Mayor and Executive in terms of what their final proposals in the papers for Council and Cabinet later this month will set out. I think I would also add,
Councillor Patrick may have a question. Do you want to ask now, Councillor Patrick? Or later? I'm assuming later. Okay, sorry about that.
I think obviously being in London, we just need to also be mindful of any proposals around council tax that are made by the Mayor of London as well. And the Mayor is currently out for consultation on the Mayor's element of the overall council tax bill, otherwise known as the GLA precept, and the proposals there are for a 9.5% increase in the GLA precept element. So obviously in making decisions locally here about our element, we just also need to be mindful of the cumulative impact of those two and its ultimate impact upon taxpayers. As you'd expect, as we're doing, as you've seen in other places, the detailed monitoring options that we develop for you, so you can see the impact of it in terms of amounts per week and amounts per month and per year. And in addition to that, also looking to bring into play the further support that was announced by government in terms of some additional resources for councils in terms of what's called the Local Council Tax Support Grant, to recognise additional costs of providing council tax support in that financial year because of the pandemic, on the back of increasing caseloads, the sad inevitability of higher unemployment rates. What we've been looking to do is prepare options for members to look to how to apply that. And again, these will be set out in detail in the future reports, which will go ultimately to full council. So very much at the end of our cycle in terms of the budget for the forthcoming financial year, and you can see there all the things we've struck off the list. I think actually it was a longer list, wasn't it, when we started some of these initial presentations, but we're very now into that 21-22 timeline. So I'll pause there, if I may, Chair, for questions.
Thanks very much. I think I've got Councillor Patrick. Is there anyone else who wants to ask a question now?
Perfect. Thank you, Chair. You haven't really raised the HRA, but I've got a question on the HRA. Yeah. Obviously, the HRA is often based on long-term borrowing and rents and money that comes, because the HRA is ring-fenced. So obviously, the borrowing for the HRA is ring-fenced on money that comes into the HRA to pay for the borrowing. I just wondered, in light of the rise in unemployment, the debt on the HRA, and the people not being able to pay their rent, and it may increase. I know we're working really hard to help people claim benefits that they're entitled to, but even the benefits they're entitled to don't really cover people's costs, and there may be even worse if the government take away the extra £20 that they've given to people this year in the pandemic. I just wondered how sustainable our projections are, and also, well, on the HRA capital budget, how we decide how you decide how much we should borrow, and then how we decide what to spend in proportion to repairs, and how we work out how much we should spend on, say, either buyback or paying for building new council properties, because often the public don't understand why we can't build new council properties at a drop of a hat. It seems to be a question that comes up often about why can't we build new council properties, and I understand that we don't get any grant for it, but people seem to don't understand. Thanks.
I'll just bring in Councillor Hayhurst, so have rounds of 2 questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. So, Ian, point 1, just if I've got it right, for 22-23, we're looking at 11 million. 0.85 million could possibly bridge by council tax rises, but we're looking at around that would take us to around 10 million. The red lined items when we had the presentation previously, would they cover that million, or would there still be further work to do? Point 2 is just on that last slide about 3.4 million CTRS. Is that a one-off payment that we've heard that is going to go to make sure people aren't going to have to pay any more council tax this year, or is that a reoccurring pot of money? And point 3 is, with Britannia coming towards, well, with us being able to see the end of Britannia in sight, I understand. To what extent is capability there possibly going on to possibly another big project, King's Hall or what have you, and are you able to start thinking about that?
Thanks very much. You okay with those questions, Ian?
Yes, certainly. If I deal with Councillor Patrick's first, if that's okay. And apologies, Councillor Patrick, if I didn't catch all of your questions. The signal broke up a bit, but I think I've got most of those.
Okay.
So, absolutely, in terms of the housing revenue account budget setting process for next year, it's probably been one of the most challenging given the circumstances within which we're operating. Really wanted to make sure that we properly understand the challenges that are existing in terms of that element of housing income that is actually paid for not by housing benefits but by cash. And you know that we put in place a good few years ago really good arrangements to not just collect that income from a traditional collecting of income perspective, but also putting in place that package of support and building upon the work that Councillor Rennison's been leading on around that one approach to council debt. So we're looking to make sure that where people do get into difficulties or have difficulties in potentially paying, they don't just get chased by each part of the council. They get actually helped. It has been a bit more challenging in recent months with the impact of the cyber attack, but I know again, when I discussed it with Ashman and David in council tax, there is definite resource going in there to put in place that support. But you've seen the figures like I have, and we are seeing the overall level of how rent arrears increasing. I still think when I look at our HRA compared to that of other boroughs of a comparable nature, I still think, you know, the overall sustainability of our HRA is a lot better than a lot of those. You know, we still have, you know, a buoyant number of properties coming in, but we are challenging. I think just to pick up on your point about borrowing, though, more specifically, obviously when we borrow, we look to borrow to invest in particularly in our redevelopments, our new builds. We don't really borrow simply to just fund revenue expenditure. But there is a difficult balance sometimes to be struck between clearly identifying and funding what is ongoing asset management works and the distinction between the genuine new build stuff. You picked up on a report which we've taken through recently around council tax, council house buybacks. And again, what we've been looking at there is not just focusing on monies we can borrow or monies we get through council rents, but also there's other sources of funding that exist. So you'll be familiar with the challenges at times we have with regards right to buy receipts. And sometimes we're not able and haven't been able at all times to spend that money as quickly as we would like to because of the conditions that are imposed upon us. So working closely with Councillor Renison, with the Mayor, we've been looking to make sure that where there are schemes and ideas to actually get stock quicker back into play, we can utilise things like those receipts to increase our stock supply much quicker. And you'll have seen only in the last week or so, we took reports through Cabinet that enabled us to buy back, I think it was 25 properties, Councillor Renison, wasn't it, into council ownership. And there are a number of others that we are working through at the moment to bring back online as well. Over the last, year or so, we have done a number of detailed sessions with members on the funding and the challenges of funding the HRA, and myself and the team are always happy to do more of those with people so that distinction, for want of a better word, between what the choices are is better understood, and certainly happy to commit to that when we've got more time than we have this evening.
Thanks, Ian, that's very helpful. I think we all welcome that the underspends are being spent on bringing back properties into the council ownership. Obviously, you all know about the shortage of social housing. Thank you for that report.
Councillor Renison, do you want to come in on this or something else?
Yeah, so one, I was hitting the wrong button, but also I was going to come in because I think Councillor Hayhurst's points probably swing slightly over more to the political, so I might pick those up if helpful. And was also going to come in on the end of Councillor Patrick's point. So yeah, thank you, Chair. Councillor Patrick, just picking up again on a couple of those as well, and apologies as I was checking notes at the time, so Ian might have covered this, but as I'm sure you've seen, we have factored potential rent losses into the budget for the HRA, just to reiterate that reassurance. And as much as I hate to say this, because to remind people of this as the Cabinet member with responsibility for housing supply, the buybacks, we do face the same financial challenge of buybacks. We do face that same, we can use a third or so from right to buy receipts, we can cover a third or so of the costs from rents, and we do still have to bridge the gap with the remainder. And so it's absolutely fantastic to bring that stock back into use, and all the better because it's on our existing estates and it benefits from being part of that, particularly in terms of long-term maintenance and everything. But just to, there's a lot of excitement and that's fantastic, but I feel like I have to also be the voice of sort of financial reason on it. That it's likewise, there is sadly no magic fix to anything in this area around the costs of bringing forward new homes. I know how strongly you feel about it, and I've seen firsthand your campaigning in Kings Park, and share your commitment to bring forward those new homes that we need. Councillor Hayhurst, apologies actually, I don't have Ian's slides open in front of me anymore, but I have a feeling that when we've edited down information previously shared, we've probably managed to miss a bullet where we bridge the sort of savings gaps. And take us down from the position we found ourselves in right at the start of the year, which I'll watch Ian to see if I get the numbers right at the top of my head, but I think we started off looking at 22 million savings for next year. We've managed to find about 8 million of those, what we call as corporate savings, cutting across the council, which we brought forward in the OFP to Cabinet this month. And those were the things like the vacancy factor, revenue contribution to capital, and then there's a recalculation in terms of pensions. And then there is a final savings gap which we will need to bring forward in with the budget papers, which will be a further few million. I can see you doing the maths. And
it was only the 11 million figure. Was that 21,
yeah,
22?
If you let me just,
sorry, go on.
Sorry, just to finish off. Effectively, the government did come in with additional COVID funding. And that is the slide, the bullet that I think got missed off the slide. So in the final round of coronavirus funding for the coming financial year, Ian will come in and correct me if I get this wrong, effectively bridged that remaining financial gap for us. So that's how, so apologies, it was on a previous slide, it dropped off this slide. We'll make sure the figures are obviously all there in the budget for transparency as to how we bridged the gap. But there are no, I suppose it's just to reassure members that there are no sudden financial decisions that are about to be taken before budget papers come later this month. The gap has been closed off with that additional funding from government, and we will bring forward, as it flagged in the slides, there's a further few £1 million worth of savings we do have to bring forward. We've been discussing those with members through various channels, and they'll be coming forward in the budget papers. But yeah, the government has managed to close the gap with the additional coronavirus funding for the coming financial year that they brought forward in the spending review. I think it is worth flagging though, and your point does give me the opportunity to do this, that despite government rhetoric that austerity is dead, and despite the fact they have brought forward extra funding around coronavirus, it's noticeable that we're still having to make savings in the middle of a pandemic just to balance our budget. And I think that speaks volumes. You also asked about CTRS and the additional funding. I mean, again, I suppose to give credit where it's due, we, thank the government that they provided this additional money, and it's because they localised council tax benefits. So providing additional financial support to councils whose caseloads very sadly are expected to go up. But yes, it's one, as stands, one-off in nature. Again, Ian will correct me, but it was announced as a one-off fund for the coming financial year, which is why we want to use it as creatively and constructively as possible and try and get money directly out to residents that need it. It's why we have to look at something in a one-year term only, as opposed to making more structural changes to our scheme. There's also the reality that the government CTRS is structured into very tight legislation, which would actually, we just wouldn't be able to change the scheme at this point, even if we did want to make recurring changes to it. So that's why we're looking at how we can deploy this additional money in the some form of direct payment, if at all possible, to those residents on CTRS. And again, I'm looking at Ian to check I get this right, but I think as well what is unusual is the way the government has given us this money. They've given us the power to do that, which isn't always a given. So again, it's this particular pot of money, the powers it comes with that enables us to do this. And that's why we want to look at how we can use it as creatively as possible, rather than just putting that in to fill our own budget gap, how we can get some of that directly out the door to residents on CTRS in as direct a way as we can, within the restraints of we don't have time to go out to consult, we need a scheme we can administer quickly and so forth. And then, apologies, Councillor Hayhouse, I think there was a final point there that I've missed.
It was just about, with Britannia ending, freeing up possibly to consider King's Hall. But my first point was about 22-23. Is that what the 11 million savings we have to find for? Is that 22-23? And it was.
Sorry.
So the slides were referring to the coming financial year, and again, they're not in front of me, but that was the gap before, as we went into the spending review, which was effectively then closed by both the additional savings that we will be bringing forward in the budget and by the additional money the government announced. But it's easy, the figures are quite comparable, because the rough figure we're working to for the dreaded fair funding review, if it goes ahead, is that will leave us at the last time we forecast circa 12 million shortfall, which is also why, and we've had conversations in other places with members, that we want to make sure we start the process we're planning for next year's budget now effectively, that we don't leave this until and sort of heave a sigh of relief that we've got this budget done and wait until the autumn, that the process needs to get underway straight away, because after a decade of austerity, finding another 10 million or so worth of savings is not going to be easy. So we want to spend as much time as possible on that process. And then I'll pass back to Ian, if that's okay, for the Britannia point.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Councillor Anderson.
Great stuff. Yeah, so just to clarify that last point, in our the budget report bringing forward, we will be updating our medium-term financial forecast as much as we can as well. And that will cover off 22-23 and touch upon 23-24. But I think we all recognise, don't we, how much uncertainty there is in those numbers with all the announcements that haven't yet been made. In terms of Britannia, so absolutely delighted that the scheme is continued to stay largely on track. It's been really challenging, hasn't it, to do that scheme in these most difficult times. And obviously, of late, the work of Morgan Sindall's been absolutely first rate in not only maintaining the programme, but also to actually looking after its staff as well, and putting in place all the things you would expect that would happen in that regard. That obviously, that scheme still has some way to go, but what we are undertaking as part of our assessment of how we deploy and organise our capital resources is a capital management review to see where we can look to move on to next. I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that Britannia scheme, though, is part of a master plan, and there are still a lot of things to happen on that scheme, particularly around phase 2, 2A and phase 2B, and decisions to be taken about what happens in relation to those. But equally, in relation to other big capital projects, we're always mindful of the need to be ahead of the game and have plans in place to make sure that we can move forwards. But ultimately, we need to make sure we've got the resources, not just financial, but also in terms of people, project management in place as well to take those forwards. But I can assure you that work is ongoing, and working closely with Steve Haynes on that.
I just wanted to very quickly come in on King's Hall to build on what Councillor Renison and Ian have already said. Clearly, we had a manifesto commitment to develop plans for King's Hall this administration period, but I think acknowledging Councillor Hayhurst that there was a multi-phase delivery at Britannia, what I think we do definitely have is a much more experienced team across finance and capital and leisure, which puts us in good stead to take that work forward. I suppose what we do not have at King's Hall, or the complexities of King's Hall, are a heritage building and an easy set of sites that can provide cross-subsidy. So I think what will happen as we develop that work is we'll have to develop a very clear business case and a financial a plan for how we could finance. Work is sort of ongoing at the moment. In the interim, it's going to require more resources to keep King's Hall open and safe, and that is also something that the teams are exploring at the moment. So it's a bit of a watch this space, I would say, Councillor Hayhurst.
Thanks very much, Mayor. I'm now going to move to Councillor Snell-Lanetti for the next round of questions.
Thanks, Chair. I wanted to burrow down a bit, Ian, in an area that's not entirely your level of responsibility, but as part of the background. I mean, if there's something that the retiring chief exec can be proud of, it is surely the way we've transformed our property portfolio. And I know you've got some control over that. I mean, the most recent publicity has obviously been in relation to Sister Space, and I feel really we've got a great story to tell in that whole area, and at the moment all we seem to be doing is getting it in the neck. But I just wanted to flag up some areas of concern. It's in this report. You talk about the very significant losses made on our property account this last year. But certainly if I'm looking up and down high streets, I'm seeing a few places, and I no doubt a good number of them are owned by the council, which don't look to me as if they're going to reopen. I was a bit surprised when we came, businesses I'm talking about there. I was also a bit surprised that when Chris answered the questions at council, we had 4 properties available for the voluntary sector, which in some ways is good, because we do want to get these into commercial use. We do want to support a vibrant economy. But what I feel is missing at the moment, and perhaps you can update me, I don't think it's entirely in your hands, because I think it partly comes under the Regen team, is we need to be looking at everything we own, both to support the voluntary sector and to support the business sector. And we need to brag about what we're doing, because it is exceptional by London standards. But we need to pull all those different options together. What are we doing to help business startups? What are we doing with our own property portfolio, to maximise income from people who can pay for it, then also creating good venues for the voluntary sector at the cheapest rates in London, as far as I know. And what are we also doing? And I know there was work in hand, but I think it might have ground to a halt, looking at how we can then also use some of those premises to support business, give them concessionary leases, and all that sort of thing. So I don't expect a full answer from you, Ian, but I'd like to sort of know what's in the pipeline and when we might see some of that work come to conclusion.
Thanks very much, Councillor Snell. I'm now going to bring in Councillor Ette. I've seen the Mayor's raised his hand, I'm assuming to come in response to these recent questions. Councillor Ette first.
Thank you, Chair. One of my questions has been answered, but I'll still go ahead. With regards to the new structure in terms of council structure with regards to staffing, what implication will that have on the budget? That's number one. Then secondly, you talked about the local council tax support grant. I just wanted to know, is that something that the government is going to give us in this financial year, or is something next financial year? And I mean, do we have an idea how much that will be? And thirdly, is there any fund at all that we have not maximized? Are we sending anything back into the government purse at all? I just want to ask that, you know, just to be sure that we maximize everything. And while you were making the presentation, you made mention of something. On the long term, what will be the cost? What fares or where do we have the maximum challenge on the long term? What would you say with regards to that?
Thanks very much, Councillor Ette. I think I'll bring in, if it's okay with everyone, I'll bring in first and then the Mayor after that. Thank you. Councillor Renison also, obviously, if you want to come in.
Thanks for that, Chair. And if I deal with Councillor Snell's questions first, if that's okay, I think if that's probably also the question the Mayor wanted to come in at as well. So if we maybe take that one first and then go to Councillor Ette's. So absolutely, you know, we're all alive to the real challenges that we're seeing happen on the high street. And I think, you know, it has been real credit to the work that a range of council teams have done to make sure we've got business grant supports out the door as quickly as we can, always trying to go faster, harder on that. But it is increasingly challenging due to some of the conditions that are put upon us. But we are looking to shift resources around as quickly as we can in relation to that. I would just say, and it's partly linked in the way to one of Councillor Ette's questions, I think, is that I know in relation to the first tranches of business grants, so where we paid out nearly, well, in the first instance, we had an allocation of £64 million. We actually ended up paying out over £70 million in grants. And so we're waiting for, you know, sort of the government to settle up with us in relation to that as part of the reconciliation exercise. But, you know, that just shows some of the complexities we're working through. But turning back to Councillor Snell's point, I think what you're referring to there, Councillor Snell, if I'm not mistaken, is something called an asset management review, where we have put in place plans to look at all council assets to see how effectively they're being used, and particularly where there's any assets that aren't being fully utilised. And that's a piece of work that's been taken forward across council, so working with colleagues in property, in regeneration finance, and the policy partnerships team, but also, you know, big service departments. There's major pieces of work going forward to see, of the assets we hold, are there better opportunities out there and how we look to deploy them. I think you've probably seen briefings in other places about the immense package of support we moved to put in place quickly to our own tenants in relation to some of the challenges they were facing on the first lockdown period. And that was, you know, to really work hard with them to make sure that they felt supported. And I have to say, you know, the commercial team have put in place an awful lot of work to really build and evolve even more so those real personal relationships they've got with each tenant. And I know from the feedback I've had, that's been really welcomed. And I suppose one of the tests in that space for me is that we haven't yet, as I sit here now, had any keys given back to us yet, in terms of, you know, that people have recognised the support. But I would say that, you know, that initial piece of work has had to be continually evolved in recent months because of further continuation of lockdown. And I think we shouldn't, we have to be mindful of the challenges, and it's why, you know, one of the areas of work that I've been discussing closely with Suzanne, Councillor Anderson, is, you know, the need to think about how we, you know, when we look to rebuild Hackney, actually really put in place the support to businesses in our own properties. Obviously, you're familiar with all the work that was done in terms of inclusive economy. And yes, whilst we have voluntary sector lettings policy, we have commercial lettings policy, work is underway to see what a different way can be in that space as well, and bring in more of that sort of social value judgments into some of this. But again, that's new space. It's quite innovative space, and, you know, again, would keep us at the forefront of what's happening in London. There's lots of great examples out there, isn't there, all over the place, from what we're seeing in the Wick down to Dalston, all over. But I think there's a lot of work going on in this space. I don't know if the Mayor, you want to add anything at this point?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. It really does start from where you left off. I think what we were trying to indicate in our responses last week is effectively a net increase in VCS usable portfolio space. in the answers that both Councillor Kennedy and I gave. And that's whether it's a project like Clapton Commons or the Mari Lloyd Centre on Queensbridge Road, is really showing that when we get an asset back, we have a look at that asset and think how it can be best deployed to support the socio and economic outputs of the council and our needs. So it isn't, and I think what we saw at Hackney Wick is the first instinct to the council wasn't to regenerate those sites or develop those sites to maximise our income. It was actually, how do these sites best contribute to that wider socio-economic agenda of Hackney Wick as it's changing? And I think we've learned a huge amount from that. I think in Dalston, in the context you'll be really familiar with, we would be building on that work, building on the Dalston conversation and thinking about how those assets can contribute and maximise the contribution to the cultural and VCS economy around Dalston Junction itself and obviously Dalston Lane. I think that is a shift. It's a shift in culture, but Ian's right in saying that knitting together kind of property, the need to generate an income, the socioeconomic outputs and the teams at the council is still an ongoing exercise. It's worth remembering that across our VCS portfolio, we stabilised that portfolio from 2011. The baseline of that was getting all of the leases regularised and introducing that £4 a square foot rent. That £4 a square foot rent hasn't changed in that decade. So we have firmly protected, I think, and invested in our voluntary sector. And all the conversations I've had is looking at preserving that rent level or something very close to it as we renew all of those leases and develop a new voluntary sector portfolio strategy as part of the asset management work that Ian's identified. And that has to be complete this financial year, because most of the leases in our voluntary sector effectively have been extended or expire in early 2022. And we want to offer that whole sector a period of co-production, the confidence that we are believing and investing in it. I think where it gets more tricky is where you're doing something in between a commercial rent in the property portfolio and a pure VCS rent, and just how you scope out the social value to justify any rent reductions. And obviously that's the sorts of conversations we have with anchor tenants in our estate all of the time. And I'm really committed, and I think we're all genuinely really committed to ensuring that when we see an uplift in the council's assets, that we get a balance between voluntary sector, community uses, and that commercial income we need to underpin our budgets going forward. But I think all of that knits together far better than it has, certainly in my time as mayor and before.
Thank you very much. And now I think I'm going to bring in, mindful of time, bring in Councillor Sharman for what's probably going to be the last question. Councillor Patrick, do you have another question as well?
And no. Sorry, Chair, we didn't come back on Councillor Retty's question either there.
I do apologise. Sorry, I'm ahead of myself. I'm so sorry. Councillor Retty's question.
Thank you for those questions, Councillor Retty. So in terms of the new structure of the Chief Executive's restructure, this is the third one of those I've done finance comments for. And I think one of the things we were very clear on when we discussed it was the fact that, that whilst there was a need for a recalibration of resources, actually we weren't in the space of being able to increase the cost. And so the finance comments were very clear in that report that, after 10 years of austerity, we'd seen effectively a 45% reduction in the cost of senior management costs. I think that's just important to put in place, but at a time when things being done has increased, so increasing productivity there. We also were able to bring into play savings from the voluntary redundancy scheme. So you'll recall there a number of chief officers retired under that scheme. So bringing together the savings accrued from that initiative and some of the adjustments for the posts in the new structure, we were able to bring in a structure that was commensurate in terms of the cost of the previous structure with the cost of the structure going forward. So no overall increase in cost there. You asked a question about the council tax support scheme for 21-22. That's 3.4 million. And you're right, that is only for 1 year. And I think the rationale for it only being 1 year is that that's the only time frame the government can currently commit to in terms of its spending envelopes. But as I said in my presentation, I'm really keen for us as a sector, and obviously as a council, to lobby hard for greater certainty about what the world will look like around funding for 22-23, even if it is just to signpost some sort of key headlines around yes, you've got same flexibilities over council tax you've got this year. There will be sales fees and charges compensation scheme. There will be a flat level of grant. And wouldn't it be great if they could actually commit to soon not doing the fairer funding review in 22-23, just because parliamentary capacity and officials' capacity in MHCLG isn't there. And I do think we'll be able to get some mood music on that very early into the next financial year. You asked also a question about real pressures that are coming forward. And I think, notwithstanding the pandemic, notwithstanding cyber, I think a lot of those pressures still continue, don't they, to be the ones that have always been in play. I do fear that after a year of the pandemic, we're going to have even more pressures around children's social care than we've been seeing before, following the backdrop of a decade of austerity, welfare reform cuts, reductions in extra capacity support in schools. I can only think that the last 12 months will have exacerbated those tensions. There still isn't a national solution to the dedicated schools grant pressures around SEND. I've got a further session in the coming weeks with officials from the Department of Education, with some colleagues from London boroughs, again to try and get a commitment to properly fund that and a way through it. Also, adult social care, not just for Hackney, but for all London boroughs and all authorities, continues to be a real challenge, doesn't it? And still no sign of a real solution to that dilemma. Temporary accommodations, as you're all aware on this scrutiny panel, continues to be a challenge for boroughs. So I think it is those heavy demand-led services. But I also think in the space that we're going into, we are going to have to be very mindful of the need to somehow identify resources to reinvest in bringing back our high streets and our places as well, because vibrant communities are necessary to enable communities to grow and flourish. And I think how we do that is something we've been able to do in the past, and I'm sure we'll be able to find innovative and creative ways through it. But I do think we're going to have to look at it across the board to get to the right place. Hopefully that answers your question.
Sorry, and Chair, if it's okay to come in very quickly on Councillor Latti's points as well. So just as well, coming back to council tax support, obviously when we took the scheme back to 85%, 50%, we set up commitment to take it back to be fully funded in Hackney over the next decade. We'd hope to take that work forward over this year, the mapping work as to how we do that. It's just the change in caseload, the level of financial uncertainty from the government has just meant it wouldn't have been practical to do. It wasn't a lack of will, it was a lack of numbers we can actually build any sort of model and roadmap on the back of. That's hopefully a piece of work we can take forward in the coming year. But again, we really need some certainty from government on our funding position. We need to know what the parameters are we've got in terms of our spending, so then we can then look at those long-term pieces of work and commitments we've made locally. And then just to reiterate what Ian said of the scale of the challenges facing us, we bring the overall financial position to Scrutiny Panel, and we've had some really fantastic conversations over the past year, and I hope that continues into the coming financial year. We'd really encourage, I'm sure encouragement isn't needed, but scrutiny colleagues to look at how some of this can go forward into specific scrutiny commissions, some of the more detailed work in different areas. And I suppose I think we're all aware of the scale of the challenge, and my concern is, and it's just to really reiterate Ian's point, that we have to look at this in the whole. So as you all know, I hold the responsibility of housing needs as well. I have a sort of a particular concern, if you like, around our sleeping services. Technically they are not statutory services, and yet we easily throw around terms like the most vulnerable. I think those are some of our most vulnerable residents in the borough that we're working with, and it'd be all too easy to focus on a couple of sort of big key areas and almost take resource of incredibly critical services. So it is that, how do we look at things in the whole? How do we look at how services interconnect? Again, drawing on rough sleeping, my view is that anyone that's ended up sleeping rough, we have failed them, or someone has failed them at some point. It's been a breakdown in statutory services that has led to rough sleeping, and we should view it as part of that response. But again, we have to view our services as interlinked. We can't just look at one or two big ticket items, if you like, and consider them in isolation. But apologies, Chair, I'm aware of the time, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. So final round. So I've got Councillor Sharman, followed by Councillor Coburn. If members could try and keep their questions brief as possible, because we're obviously aiming to finish by 9. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I mean, first of all, I think we should congratulate everyone on bringing in the 2021 budget. It is quite an achievement considering where we started. And I think it's not only a good result, it's also been a good process. And I think it's something we should learn very much, as I think Rebecca's just been saying, for next year's budget. And I do absolutely endorse Ian's point about the importance of trying to get 3-year projections and to think ourselves in a long-term sense. The trouble is, it's very easy for us to get into a sort of victim role, in a sense. The government is playing us in this very absurdly short-term way. We've got to somehow break out of it. And I'd just like to make a couple of points about that. It does seem to me that the coming out of COVID is going to create a whole range of challenges for particular groups. Rebecca's just highlighted the homeless, but there are going to be a whole range of groups, young people who haven't been through school, with jobs we've been talking about earlier. So there are going to be a range of groups who have been particularly victimized by this. And I guess thinking through how we finance or how we draw up programs that help it and how we support that within next year's budget, but looking at it over the 3 years. Because in a way, I'm seeing this as a potential list for government to say, look, we're going to do this. You should gear in your help around this. In other words, we get more onto the front foot on the 21-22 budget. So that was one point, just particularly for Ian and Rebecca, how we might pick up that challenge across the board. Clearly, departments have got a role, scrutiny commissions, but we've also got to manage it as a whole as well. And I guess that takes me to the second point, which is how we take forward, I think, what's been very successful work between audit and scrutiny in terms of matching this challenge. And I guess it's primarily to Rebecca. We've got a meeting, I think, scheduled in next week. The kind of agenda we might tackle that and the kind of approach we might take. So we're building in not a reactive process as we necessarily had last year, but a positive programme for change.
Thanks very much, Councillor Coburn.
I should be very quick, and thank you again for taking my time. Rebecca, nice to see you, and Ian, just thank you again for your report. It was just a quick question. I thought I heard it, but I might have been incorrect. I might have missed it. I was just wondering, I mean, obviously, you know, we have a lot of conversation, as I mentioned earlier to Tim, about sort of recovery. And, you know, there's always an assumption that things will get better, and then we just plan for that day. But I was just wondering about our resilience strategy and sort of what that leaves, what happens to our resilience strategy, you know, not just in terms of the council as an institution, but also thinking about our economy and thinking about, you know, like I know the mayor spoke about sort of the voluntary sector and on our businesses as well. But I'm just thinking about, you know, what does our, you know, when do we start to look at that, and what does that potentially sort of look like going forward?
Okay, so planning to be in the front foot going forward, and planning and resilience. Thank you.
Chair, shall I perhaps come in on those first? Ian can start waving if I get stuff wrong, and then I don't know if the mayor wants to come in on that wider resilience point as well. So Councillor Sharman, on challenges coming out of coronavirus, speaking from a financial point of view, you'll be reassured to know that we have set aside money in the budget, recognising that we'll need some flexibility. So alongside existing work planning that's taken place across different services across the council, and what services need to look like in coming year and how they will respond to resident needs, we do have additional resource there that we've put in place that we know we can draw down on as and when it's needed, to give us that flexibility and to help address the high level of uncertainty we face going into the coming year. And you're quite right, I feel slightly embarrassed that colleagues have thanked finance officers for their work in forecasting in such difficult circumstances, and I haven't tonight, so I'll reiterate my thanks to Ian and the team, and we'll make sure I do so as we bring in the budget papers in the coming month. And I think you're right as well. Got to be very careful when we talk about 114s, and obviously what happened at Croydon was complex and details are still coming out. But I think, you know, you go and read things like the auditor report and things like that, and we do have to be very aware of how issues can build, and actually how difficult as it is, and you're right, it's a balancing act. We have to face the austerity challenge set by government. We can't pretend it's not happening. But you're also right about trying to be strong and carve out our own narrative and direction. And I think it's something for all of us to remember when we all have policies we want to see taken forward and initiatives we want to see taken forward. And it's how we do that in a sustainable way that ensures those services are put in place, not just for the coming year for residents, but we know they'll be in place for future years going forward, and that we can continue to offer that level of service. And I think that is a challenge for all of us, and certainly it's something, as you know, we go into the next budget session round, I will be my responsibility to remind fellow councillors of that. Actually, you know, some of these things we really want to take forward, they have a high recurring cost, and we have to be aware of when we commit to those that they necessarily exclude other decisions or other things they would equally like to commit to. In terms of how to take forward the work between audit and scrutiny, you've flagged that we have got the meeting coming up, so I can't just say, well, we're meeting to discuss it. But what I would share, and for those not familiar, this has been a working group that we've convened that has had representatives from Audit Committee and Scrutiny Panel, and it's been incredibly useful. First of all, in that budget scrutiny, as we came into the pandemic and there's huge uncertainty in terms of support government might offer councils and the impact of income loss, it's then helped to inform the budget setting process for the coming year. And we now need to look at how we maintain that scrutiny and that engagement going forward. And hopefully what we can discuss in the meeting is how we get that balance between the overall sort of financial oversight role, and particularly audit part perhaps within that. But also I know scrutiny colleagues, I'm sure, will be wanting to get into the detail of some of those savings and what they might mean for services and how we develop and take those forward over the coming year. So hopefully when we meet, we can work out, it's not for me, I'm very aware that I don't want to step on audit and scrutiny toes, so we'll take a steer from yourselves as to how you see that balance working, and how you see that group charting a path through that. And then I suspect, Councillor Coburn, I realise your question about resilience is much broader than just financial resilience. But just on the financial points, to reassure you that as we've been setting the budget for the coming year, again, sort of, and it goes back to Councillor Sharma's point really about being quite strict and firm with ourselves and realistic, if you like, about the arena we're operating in. We have still built in those contingencies and those fallbacks, if you like, for what we expect to be a very difficult financial year coming. So we've set a balanced budget, or will be setting a balanced budget, and we also know we've got the resources there if we need to fall back on them. So financially we go into the year in as strong a position as possible, but I suspect you're probably interested in the much wider question around resilience. So I'll hand over to the Mayor if I can see he's ready to come in.
Thanks, Councillor Coburn. I was thinking of answering in the question of sort of how do we support the economy to be resilient, because I think that touches on some of the other points that have been raised. And I think the teams that are now working closer and closer together across communications and engagement, place-based regeneration, the chief executive's restructure of how then they link into housing delivery, but also the links across into planning. I think around each of our town centres, there's a very strong team of multidisciplinary officers looking at how we make those places more resilient and think about the changing nature of what they're for and how we support that. And I think they're increasingly good at making business cases to Ian and the finance team about making the capital investment in whether it's plan making, whether it's around things like Hackney Central Station, and developing all of that. I do also think you've probably heard from Councillor Williams when she's either been before SEG or this commission, is a huge amount of resilience exists within Hackney Opportunities and now the Integrated Adult Education Service, and thinking about what that economy will need, what people will need in terms of skills, what our residents will need to either stay in work, go back to work, or approach the workplace for the first time after a long period of unemployment. And I think we've been able to really nimbly shape something like Kickstarter locally because we have that capacity within the council and resilient teams to do the thought leadership to work with DWP in ways that other local authorities are not. So from that point of view, I don't take any of that work for granted. And I suppose the best we can do is maintain our existing investment in those work strands. And I think that's something we are committed to doing. It's in next year's budget. And the most challenging bit, I suppose, is that a lot of the things that underpin both planning and that the Hackney Opportunities Service are Section 106 contributions, and what happens around development in the borough and how we use growth to deliver a more inclusive economy is something that I know those teams are looking at, and Councillor Nicholson is looking at as well, because you're effectively making long-term investment using some of the resources that we get through Section 106 and CIL, and that could be more difficult if the development situation changes and alters. But as things stand at the moment, we're able to maintain that existing investment and make sure that that resilience exists.
Thanks so much. I don't know whether Ian's got a final word before we draw this item to a close.
I think we've covered all the points, Chair, and I'm very conscious that we've overrun your guillotine time of 9 o'clock, so I won't say any more.
Okay, so we're just going to briefly run through the final items on the agenda. So item 6, can we agree the minutes of the previous meeting? There's one matter I'll come to quickly.
Agreed.
Yeah, matter arising, we've got a response from the Director of Communications on, I think, page 70 to 72.
Yep.
This is something that I propose to take forward with scrutiny leads and members, so that we can arrange to meet with that team to receive appropriate training. And then item 7 is the work programme panel. The remainder of this year. So the working document. So our next meeting and final one of this municipal year is on the 8th of March, which is going to be a panel discussion on food poverty with speakers internally from Hackney and also from outside the borough, and an update on the Advice Services Review. Have members got any comments or questions about the work programme?
No.
Nope.
No, Chair.
Item 8 is any other business. Is any other business before we conclude the meeting?
No.
Nope.
No,
Thank
Chair.
you very much. We almost did it 4 minutes over.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thanks very
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Bye.
Bye.